If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Sabbat the Black Hand, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. On the 25th of May 2021, almost a year ago at the time of recording, Renegade Game Studios announced the Sabbat the Black Hand via their Twitter page. As of this recording, Sabbat the Black Hand is the newest sourcebook for the most recent incarnation of Vampire the Masquerade, which is 5th edition. It was greeted with mixed reception, to put it nicely, reasons I will discuss later in this review. I was honestly quite nervous about this book's existence, sharing some of these sentiments. That, and the Camarilla and Anarch books for V5, both of which I've reviewed already, failed to move me the way that I had hoped. This is also the first physical book to be released under the new in-house team at World of Darkness, most of the same folks who worked on the V5 companion book, and if you listen to my review on that free supplement, you will know just how much I loathed the storyless approach. But I tried to remain positive, wanting to be proved wrong, eager to wait through the delays and the international shipping clusterfuck beyond Renegade Game Studios' control. When it was released on the 27th of October 2021, an eager fan of the podcast gave me a copy of their PDF version to read, which I quickly amended, as that is technically piracy. So I have read this book many times already, probably one of the first in the UK to do so, and had lots of time to digest my thoughts on the book and the discourse surrounding it. Now, with the physical copy in my possession, I can finally present you my review and oh boy, do we have a lot to unpack here. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and how easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has a start of the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book with a very sinister, sliced-up vampire face on the front cover. I am assuming it is meant to be Lucita de Aragon weeping blood tears, something I find a tad too edgy for my liking, despite the fact I know vampires can only weep vitae. Imposed onto her is the title of the book and a revised Sabbat logo, which is exactly the same as the older one, but lacks the spiky bits on the sword itself. It's an unneeded change that doesn't really do much for the sect. In the background are ready blood skulls that give me Earthbound vibes. If you get the bit that I'm referencing, congratulations, you're old enough to claim your pension. The back cover uses similar fonts and styles to the blurb and is placed against a fiery coloured marble design which serves its purpose, making the Sabbat stand out from their more humane Camarilla and Anarch counterparts. Sticking to the blurry skulls on the front cover might have been a better choice, but V5 is not exactly known for its consistency with anything now, is it? That said, if you own the Camarilla and Anarch books and the V5 core book in a physical format, you'll be very familiar with how this book feels and looks. The only thing that sets it apart from the Camarilla and Anarch books is that the physical copy of the Sabbat book comes with a red ribbon bookmark, which is a nice addition, I suppose. The book uses a combination of illustrations and photography for its artwork, the style's newer and older fans might recognise as they scan the fine glossy pages. Many of the photos are provided by Mark Kelly, who manages to encapsulate the modern kindred, or should I say Knight, with eerie perfection. I'm particularly impressed by the pieces on pages 22, 26 and 104. What I am not fond of is the use of bisexual lighting throughout for groups of untrustworthy vampires that are described on more than one occasion as sexual predators that everyone fears and hates for trying to pervert the status quo and infect them with their malicious taint. Where I would usually applaud the use of bi-lighting, this artistic direction here strikes a little too close to home, and I am disappointed this narrative is the one being pushed. Those who have a copy of the V5 Companion will recognise the colourful and detailed style of Christoph Beinowska, whose name I have probably butchered horribly, to which I am dreadfully sorry. I enjoy his work and his interpretations of vampires in the World of Darkness, even though I am not sure how well it fits in, but I am putting that down to the fact that his style is new and different, and I'm just simply not used to it. To highlight some particular examples of the work I enjoy here, I'm rather smitten by the pieces found on pages 65 and 92, despite the fact they just exist on the white pages like much of the artwork found within this book. In fact, much of the presentation as a whole was a mixed bag, with some pages being spread out beautifully, minus the wonderful artwork that just sits on a page to take up space, whilst other page layouts are just lazily put together, such as the latter part of chapter 4 and the various handwritten notes, which look particularly cheap, as in, grab a stock image of crumpled up paper and type in edgy font cheap. I know trying to make these written letters look authentic digitally is a tricky thing to do, having done it myself, but previous V5 books from Modiphius and Onyx Path managed to pull this off more effectively with more style and finesse, giving each letter and the book they belong to more character and emotion. When you open the book and read the weekly written letter, speech, declaration Fini, from whom I'm assuming is Sasha Vikos, you are greeted with the introductory chapter that tells the reader how exactly they want you to use a previously playable faction that has existed since the 90s, which is to treat the Sabbat as antagonists, a key word that will come up again in this book review, I'm sure. Players new to VTM via V5, whose Sabbat experiences come from these books, forum horror stories, or the video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, may be entitled to believe that to be the case. If you're an older fan, you will immediately notice that it's not as one-sided as that. The Sabbat presented here are very different incarnations to ones presented in previous versions of Vampire the Masquerade. From my own independent research, the Sabbat present here are closer to their original from way back when in 1st or 2nd edition. That being said, it does not take long to discover that much of that original nuance and interest has been either lost or retconned. The most immediate and confusing example I can present to you at this early stage in the book is that the Black Hand, previously a secretive military subsect within the Sabbat that held it together through great crisis and countless civil wars, is now simply an alternate nickname for the Sabbat, much like how the Ivory Tower and the Movement are named for the Camarilla and Anarchs respectively. Such a change is never really explained, and its lasting impact only muddies many years of established order and structure. Such observations with honest eyes pretty much sums up the tone of the entirety of the fucking book. Chapter 1 expands upon the short paragraphs of the previous chapter, presenting an overview of the Sabbat in V5 in an easily understandable manner. They are bloodthirsty cultic vampires with no sense of individuality or motives beyond fighting the fight against the antediluvians and conquering domains. Only they, both author and Sabbat, cannot decide whether they establish said domains or not, as information here is contradicted in Chapter 3 as they fight the Gehenna War, which is simultaneously exclusively in the Middle East and everywhere. The Sabbat had domains. They ruled much of the Americas and Canada. They always fought against the antediluvians that are said to be puppeteering the vampires of the Camarilla and Anarchs. It doesn't make a great deal of sense to me that any sane individual would take the entirety of a faction to claim new cities, just to leave them as naked as babes, when the Sabbat had their own to begin with, domains I mean. It also proposes the question of whether the Sabbat are an informal or organised army, but what on earth is an informal army beyond a bunch of terrorists? Surely, in order to have this great exodus across the planet, probably by planes or boats or a mixture of the two, there would have to be a huge amount of organisation and cooperation, far more so than the writers are presenting in this alleged idiot cult. The next chapter is a beefy chapter with a lot going on. First, we are presented with the many paths of enlightenment that make up the very soul and heart of the Sabbat. Well, actually it's 5 and a bit, and I'm extraordinarily baffled by the descriptions made here when revising said paths. The main paths presented are the Path of Cain, the Path of Cathari, the Path of Death unto the Soul, and the Path of the Power into the Inner Voice has 2 pages to themselves, with one of them being a Mark Kelly photo. Each path has had all restraint and nuance removed from them, resulting in having the path reduced to their most violent conclusion, often falling into Sabbat player stereotypes that only want to be on a path to diabolize their way to power. Now, I did say 5 paths, but I only gave you 4. There is a brand new one called the Path of the Sun, which is far weirder than you think, but I will touch upon that in a moment. The Path of Cain would previously have its followers partake in diablerie to become that bit closer to Cain, whilst understanding their potential and not taking their curse for granted. Now, Noddists just want to exult in the potency it yields, to quote the book directly. A subtle change in language it may be, but it speaks volumes. The path of Kafari is now just sexual perversion and cruelty for the sake of it, rather than a means of exploring the push and explosion of the definition of sin. It is here where my complaints about the inappropriate use of bisexual lightning come into their own, despite my previous praise admiring the photo found on page 22. The path of death and the soul didn't look at the job description. It is not destructive academia, but exploring death and the soul and the middle ground between the two. The path of power and the inner voice is mostly accurate if you were to give a sentence description about it, for that is mostly what is delivered. Then there is the new path of enlightenment, the path of sun, which is a path of enlightenment but not really a path of enlightenment, for Finbloods that have basically gone, "Fuck you, Sabbat, we can hold our own in your sect and we don't believe in your fucking dog shite," which is an ethos I like, admittedly, but anyone who has any passing knowledge on the Sabbat at all knows their distinct brand of hatred they have garnered for the Finbloods. The main reason being the Duskborn are the bringers of the end times. This is why they are killed pretty quickly on sight, not because they're not being able to pass the creation rites because their vitae is too weak. There are 3 other paths mentioned, now referred to as Forsaken Paths, which also get the same unfortunate treatment, the paths being the Path of the Beast, Honourable Accord, and Lilith. Their write-ups are far too short, limited only to short paragraphs on a single page. The Path of the Beast is perhaps the better write-ups for this section, addressing that Cainites treat themselves and the Beast as the same entity, despite falling flat on its face by saying they are the ones to frenzy the most, when that originally was actively discouraged. The Path of Honourable Accord, on the other hand, totally misses the mark, as it now is more a humane path, which was just not the case. The Path of Lilith addresses the worship of Lilith in Cainite society as an alien process, detached from the humanity that most vampires cling to, something I've mentioned a few times in previous episodes. Whilst not wrong in its shallow descriptions, there are plenty of V5 write-ups of the Bahari, all of which surpass this short paragraph. These frustrations aside, it is ultimately a redundant section of the second chapter when presenting the Sabbat as storyteller NPCs. Players are highly unlikely to have a sit down and have a jolly old chat with their Sabbat foes and vice versa. Is a hunt for a Sabbat pack likely to be interrupted by a spiritual debate about the ethos of the importance of hastening one's death for the purposes of cultic science? No! And yet, the authors go on about the main 4 paths and the Finblood idea, talking about preferred disciplines, role-playing advice, and even mentioning not every path of enlightenment followers are Sabbat, which I would be impressed by if the paths were presented for players to include into their own stories of their own characters. There are even cool symbols these paths that serve the same function as clan symbols, for paths have replaced clans, a point I will discuss later on. Beyond the use of merchandising, the path symbols are also pointless because playing the Sabbat in V5 is the wrong way to play the game, as stated by the authors on the 7th fucking page of the book. To that end, storytellers are then presented with 13 pages of various vampire types and monsters that fit into each path type, each with stats and descriptions of their function and behaviours within each pack, now consisting of vampires of the same path of enlightenment, which was never something that worked before. Whilst I always appreciate stats and notes for newer storytellers, and some of the concepts being rather terrifying, this section of the book feels insultingly gamey. I felt I was reading a Dungeons & Dragons monster manual but with vampires. Some even have gamey titles like Siege, Dominion, and Vanguard. To add to this, new discipline powers, blood rituals, and oblivion ceremonies for the Sabbat are presented, which are appropriately many levels of fucked up, but as with the aforementioned vampire manual section, none of this is for player consumption, unless you want to start taking stains and attempt to have a chat with the ST on how your Anarch and Camarilla vampires got hold of such Sabbat vampire powers. The chapter concludes with various pages on retae that members of the Sabbat partake in, which, once again, are highly unlikely things for player characters to actively do themselves. Perhaps at a push, a twisted Anarch Baron of Clan Zemitzi or Brujar who had transitioned over from the Sabbat might encourage this amongst players, but that is me trying way too hard to think of a plausible situation where such a thing could occur. The same couldn't be said for the changes made to Monomancy, which, for those who don't know, is a sacred duel the sect used to settle grievances and are usually fought to the death as high-ranking Sabbat members make decisions. It's a sacred ritual used to challenge inadequate leadership. It wouldn't be used, as implied here, to goad players into a tricky situation. No, they will just kidnap and torture you, suck you dry, and leave your ashes as a warning, or, more simply, they'd fucking kill you! Finally, we arrive at Chapter 3, which has a lot of information that really could be placed in the earlier chapters. Here, we learn a bit more about Sabbat culture, their contradictory infiltration tactics, and the titles, most of which I've just described, caused eye-twitching moments in some capacity throughout. For example, with each of the titles in the book deemed the most important, examples are given of vampires of that position, such as Lucita de Aragon as the Archbishop of Madrid, whom most fans know as the La Sombra. We are told she is a follower of the Path of Night, which was strange, as I actually believed she was very low down on the path of humanity, but hey, what the fuck do I know? Anyway, Path of Night isn't fully explained here, other than the book stating,
"The Path of Night appears to be a variant of the Path of Kafari, and Lucita's its preeminent adherent,"
which couldn't be further from the truth in every sense. It was something that confused me as much as it angered me, for there is a lot of differences between these paths, and Lucita certainly is not the shining example of the Path of Night followers. But hey, as both paths presented here allow the Canaanite to cause a great amount of pain and suffering onto others, that makes them the same, apparently? On the topic of paths of enlightenments, more information is presented about them, mainly about the change in taking on a path, which is actually not a terrible read. Again, it is almost pointless including it here, as you are told Sabbat are not player characters, and you're never likely going to create a character that is old enough in 5th edition to truly benefit the need to make the transition. It is just more storyteller-only fluff that should really happen in the background without the players knowing or caring about it. Then there is the redefining of the term Antitribu. As I mentioned earlier on, there are no clans in the Sabbat. Every vampire there is an Antitribu. This is because the clans and their very names belong to their respective antediluvians, and removing your clan name and indeed your actual name goes that step further to make you a vampire first in this war-hungry murder cult. This makes sense on paper, as the La Sombra and Tzimisce, the heart and soul of the Sabbat, are no longer there for the most part, which leaves the others to fend for themselves. It is a neat idea, I admit, but I am not fond of it. What does annoy me is that this whole section, including their examples as Lucita de Aragon and Sasha Vikos as La Sombra and Tzimisce Antitribu respectively, is retcon at its laziest. Bloodlines such as the Aramans, Giacid, Assamite, Warrior Salubri, and the Serpents of the Light, all of which are canonically very proud of their lineage, but no longer exist here because... Chapter 4 is about the Gehenna War and the history of the Sabbat. The latter I would feel would be better at the front of the book also. As for the Gehenna War, we are reminded once again that it is happening everywhere, but mainly in the Middle East, Russia, and the other vague places that most players will never get to visit in or out of game because they don't live there, and there will never be a sourcebook detailing the ins and outs of said places. Most of the VTM market, and indeed the books themselves, are based in America and Western Europe. The best we will get are a maximum of one-page write-ups, and just be happy with that. Only, I'm not, because a couple of sentences about something that happened in Kiev doesn't make a book any more cultured. If anything, the inclusion of culture here feels very forced. It's just acknowledging the huge lack of culture coming from the writing team and the lack of will to be truly diverse. This is especially apparent when the large writing team of 4 cis men and 3 of them are from the West and white. The only woman involved in the writing is via diversity reading, which was done by Stephanie Cohen, and I think it is a tad odd that diversity is assigned to one person, which doesn't exactly scream diversity. Mini rant aside, we learn that the Sabbat has taken over Alamut. I am guessing this is an Easter egg of sorts, but it is not very clever. First of all, consider previous chapters of this book claiming the Sabbat do not claim new territory. That is, except for when they do because reasons. Second, no one with any understanding of the game and the established material would believe that the Assamites didn't have the defenses in place to stop this, but the willingness to stand by and just let the Sabbat in and run amok. They would also know that the one making this charge was a Salubri, given how deep their own proud history goes, a legacy they would have surely passed down from sire to childer. Finally, Chapter 5 is all about storyteller resources, giving the ST even more tools to use the Sabbat against their players. Some suggestions and ideas are better than others, and I'm sure the new V5 storyteller can find some use from it to present blood-sucking baddies at their players. But that's just it, isn't it? Sabbat the Black Hand is a book marketed by Renegade Game Studios as an antagonist book, which is where most of the backlash is from. Not because fans didn't view the Sabbat as antagonists, but because they know that all vampires are antagonists. But the wording of said marketing did mean that the Sabbat, were not going to be getting the player character's treatment for V5. On the surface, it makes sense. The Sabbat are, to the eyes of most, monsters, and the stories focused on humanity doesn't gel well with the developers' idea of what should work in their game. However, given the extra push V5 makes to have a balance between humanity and beast, all the sects are extremist groups with very rigid ideas. They hide from their humanities but do so in very different manners. The descent to savagery, having your life torn from you as you come to terms with the new existence in a heavy world of politics and centuries-old conflict, makes a perfect example of V5 storytelling. Now, am I talking about the Sabbat or am I talking about the Camarilla? They are two sides of the same bloody coin and ultimately make up the Vampire the Masquerade experience. Only it feels the developers of this new direction of Vampire the Masquerade do not think this is the V5 experience, or rather that it should not be the V5 experience. Like lore and established canon doesn't matter, giving themselves big pats on the backs like it's a really clever statement. It really isn't. When it comes to game, the established metaplot means jack shit. You could run a Camarilla game with, I don't know, a Lianan Prince, a Children of Osiris Sheriff, and a Noread Harpy if you wanted to, just because you like the idea and how it goes against the established mold. However, what many choose to ignore is that choices like that don't really come from nowhere. The vampires that make up these sects do not exist within a void. Vampire the Masquerade is a lore-driven game whose narratives and interesting developments in the metaplot help progress the grander game forward in ways that usually make sense. It is why World of Darkness games are called storytelling games. Things happen in and out of the game that changes the world and the story you choose to play. A lot of the lore is rather complicated and incredibly garbage, which has often pushed players away from the franchise. Content creators and lore enthusiasts like myself interpret the lore and try to deliver it in engaging ways to make it easy for others to understand, but that doesn't solve the problem officially, especially when large chunks of it are changed in newer versions for no reason and leave the fans confused. There are two ways to deal with this issue. The first is to write good stories to explain the reasons behind massive changes, or you reset the world, choosing what defines the world setting and discard everything else. What the writers at World of Darkness HQ have actually done with their latest two books is reset part of the world and insist they haven't. The writers for the various Onyx Path supplements have presented books that develop the stories they presented in V20 and the older lines before them. This new team at World of Darkness HQ are treating all lore, canon and metaplot before them as some sort of barrier preventing entry, and anyone who likes said lore are gatekeeping power gamers. I find this to be rather ironic, as practically all praise I have seen with the V5 Sabbat book only talks about the new powers. Creating interesting lore with deeply developed history is not gatekeeping. Players gatekeep, not lore. If your game is known for its intricate lore and you want to eradicate gatekeeping in your players, tackle the toxicity in your player base, not eradicating lore. It often feels I'm shouting into a void, as it seems most of the fans on social media are praising the new backwards direction, the blind leading the blind. If it wasn't clear, I do not like this book. In fact, I hate it for being a confusing, contradictory mess of a sourcebook that can't decide on what it is trying to do, whilst looking astonishingly far lesser than pretty much every single Vampire the Masquerade book prior to this one in an artistic sense. Yes, it does a fantastic job presenting the Sabbat as vampiric villains for players to go up against or watch from the distance, but it fails to describe and develop the sects in ways that have been compelling across all previous editions of Vampire the Masquerade. The Sabbat, according to this V5 book, are no longer violently nuanced characters, but just one-dimensional baddies to dump at players and the brain juices refuse to come up with practically anything else. It is very upsetting, having read the book multiple times, knowing that World of Darkness HQ could have done something incredible with this book, providing new and exciting ways ways to enhance the sect. They could have filled it to the teeth with rich culture and altered character creation rules to accommodate Sabbat PCs so players could make use of those paths of enlightenment and discipline powers rather than lock them away for storytellers, essentially gatekeeping portions of the game away from most of the buyers of this book. What they have done is given the fans something that barely passes a bare bones book and certainly doesn't warrant the £40 price tag. There's been a massive failure on the part to read the room and why exactly the fans wanted the Sabbat to make a comeback to V5, and I am terribly upset and extremely disappointed by this book and quite nervous about how they plan on dealing with things in the future. Reading the free preview of the Second Inquisition sourcebook seemed to follow a similar shallow gamey vibe, so whoopee! If you're new to V5 and this is your only experience of the Sabbat, I have no doubt you will find some fun with your vampire monster manual that oozes confused blood-crazed lunatics. For everyone else, you have much better books in your collection and stuff on the Storyteller's Vault, such as The Sword of Cain, a V5 guide to the Sabbat by Raymond Jenkins, which I highly recommend anyone purchasing over this. It's a much better use of your time and money, I promise. And for those of you who are new to the Law by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I don't do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Honey Trap out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, and you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.